I never meant for him to hear those words. They weren't even true. Not really. Just the frustrated ramblings of a woman having a bad day, venting to her sister over wine. But the moment I saw Mark's face in the doorway, I knew our marriage would never be the same. It had started as a typical Thursday evening. Mark was supposed to be at his weekly basketball game with colleagues, and I'd invited my sister Sophie over for our regular catch-up. The house was quiet, except for the gentle hum of the dishwasher and the clink of wine glasses as we sat at our kitchen island, the autumn sun setting through the bay windows. "I just don't understand why he can't pick up after himself," I complained, swirling the red wine in my glass. "It's like living with a teenager sometimes, and don't get me started on how he's let himself go. Remember how fit he was when we first met?" Sophie nodded sympathetically, but I could see the slight disapproval in her eyes. She'd always been Mark's defender, even when we were dating 7 years ago. Still, I couldn't stop myself from continuing. If I met him now, if I was single and just met this version of him, I'd never date him. God, that sounds awful, doesn't it? But it's true. He's nothing like the man I fell in love with. The words hung in the air for a moment before I heard it, the soft scuff of shoes on hardwood. My heart stopped as I turned toward the kitchen entrance. There stood Mark, still in his gym clothes, his gym bag dropped forgotten at his feet. His face was completely blank, but his eyes, I'll never forget the look in his eyes. "Game was canceled," he said quietly. "Coach's kid is sick." Before I could speak, before I could explain or take back those horrible words, he turned and walked away. I heard his footsteps on the stairs, then the bedroom door closing with a decisive click. Sophie touched my arm gently. "Sarah, you need to go talk to him." But I couldn't move. My mind was racing through all the times I'd carelessly complained about Mark, all the little digs and criticisms I'd thrown his way over the years. Had I really become that person? The kind of wife who tears down her husband behind his back? "I should give him some space," I said weakly, but Sophie shook her head. "That's the last thing you should do right now. Go up there and fix this." I stood up, my legs shaky, and made my way upstairs. The bedroom door was closed, and I could hear movement inside, drawers opening and closing, hangers scraping across the closet rod. My stomach clenched as I realized what he was doing. "Mark?" I knocked softly. "Can we talk?" The movement inside paused for a moment, then resumed. I tried the handle, but it was locked. "Please, let me explain. What you heard? It wasn't what it sounded like." The door opened suddenly, and I stumbled back. Mark stood there with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder, his face set in lines I'd never seen before. "I think it was exactly what it sounded like," he said, his voice controlled but trembling slightly. "You're right. I'm not the man you fell in love with. And clearly, you're not the woman I married either." He brushed past me and headed down the stairs. I followed, panic rising in my chest. "Where are you going? Mark, please, let's just talk about this." He paused at the front door, and for a moment I thought he might turn around, but he just shook his head. "I'm going to stay at Dave's for a while. I need to think about some things." The door closed behind him with a quiet finality that was somehow worse than if he'd slammed it. I stood there, frozen, as his car started up and pulled away from our house, our home of 5 years. Sophie appeared beside me, her face grave. "Oh, Sarah," I turned to her, tears finally spilling over. "What have I done?" The next few days passed in a fog of unanswered calls and ignored text messages. I cycled through every emotion possible: guilt, anger, fear, and a bone-deep regret that seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. The house felt impossibly empty without Mark's presence, without the sound of him humming while he cooked, or the sight of his shoes scattered by the door. I kept replaying that moment in my head, seeing his face in the doorway, hearing my own thoughtless words. The truth was, I'd fallen into a habit of complaining about Mark that had nothing to do with who he really was, and everything to do with my own dissatisfaction with life. Somewhere along the way, I'd started taking him for granted, picking at his flaws instead of appreciating everything he brought to our marriage. On the 3rd day, I finally got a text from him. "I'll come by Saturday to pick up more clothes. Please make sure you're not home." The message hit me like a physical blow. I called Sophie immediately, my voice shaking. "He doesn't even want to see me," I told her. How am I supposed to fix this if he won't talk to me? Maybe you need to respect his wishes right now, Sophie said gently. Give him the space he's asking for. But what if space is the last thing we need? What if it just makes things worse? Sarah, Sophie's voice became firm, you hurt him. Deeply. He heard his wife say she wouldn't even give him a chance if she met him today. That's not something a person gets over quickly. I sank onto my couch, clutching a throw pillow that still smelled faintly of Mark's cologne. I didn't mean it. You know I didn't mean it. Do I? Because you've been making comments like that for months now. About his weight, about his job, about how he doesn't measure up to your expectations anymore. Maybe it's time to ask yourself why you've been so unhappy. Her words struck a chord I hadn't wanted to acknowledge. The truth was, my dissatisfaction had little to do with Mark, and everything to do with my own stalled career, my unfulfilled dreams of writing a novel, the general sense that life wasn't turning out the way I'd imagined. Instead of dealing with those feelings, I'd turned Mark into my emotional punching bag. Saturday came, and as requested, I left the house while Mark collected his things. When I returned, I found more empty spaces in our closet, gaps in the bathroom cabinet where his toiletries had been. He'd taken his laptop and the framed photo of us from our honeymoon that usually sat on his nightstand. The sight of that missing photo broke something in me. I sat down at our kitchen table and wrote him a letter, pouring out everything I'd been too proud or too blind to say before. Dear Mark, I know words can't undo what I said, but I need you to know how deeply I regret hurting you. The truth is, you're not the one who's changed. I am. I've become someone I don't like very much. Someone who takes out her own insecurities and disappointments on the person who least deserves it. You've always been the steady one. The one who believes in me, even when I don't believe in myself. You're the one who encouraged me to keep writing, even after my third rejection letter. Who celebrated every small victory with me. Who never once complained when I spent our savings on that writing workshop in New York. The person I wouldn't date now? That's not you. It's me. I'm the one who's lost sight of what matters, who's forgotten how to be grateful for the amazing partner I have. I miss you. I miss your horrible puns and the way you always burn the edges of your grilled cheese sandwiches. I miss how you can tell when I'm having a bad day, just by the way I close the front door. I miss your kindness, your patience, your unwavering support. I understand if you need space. I understand if you can't forgive me right away or maybe ever. But please know that I love you, and I'm so sorry for taking that love for granted, Sarah. I sealed the letter and drove to Dave's house, leaving it in his mailbox. Then I went home and did something I hadn't done in months. I opened my laptop and started writing. Not my novel, but a journal entry about how I'd lost my way and what I needed to do to find it again. A week passed with no response to my letter. I threw myself into self-reflection and therapy, finally confronting the issues I'd been avoiding. Dr. Thompson, my therapist, helped me see patterns I'd been blind to. How I'd developed a habit of external blame when feeling unfulfilled. How I'd stopped communicating honestly with Mark long before that fatal evening. When was the last time you told Mark about your dreams? She asked during one session. Not just the surface stuff, but your real fears and hopes. I had to think about it. I can't remember. And when was the last time you asked about his? That question hit even harder. I'd been so wrapped up in my own discontent that I'd stopped seeing Mark as a person with his own struggles and aspirations. I'd reduced him to a list of habits that annoyed me, forgetting the man who'd once stayed up all night helping me edit a story for a competition, who'd learned to cook gluten-free when I had to change my diet, who'd supported every wild dream I'd ever had. After 2 weeks of silence, I got another text from Mark. We need to talk. Can you meet me at Riley's tomorrow at 7? Riley's was where we had our first date. My heart jumped at the suggestion. Was it a sign that he'd chosen that place? But I forced myself to temper my hopes. Meeting in public meant he wanted neutral ground, somewhere he could leave easily if things got difficult. I arrived early, choosing a booth in the corner where we'd sat 7 years ago. Mark walked in precisely at 7, and my breath caught. He looked tired, with shadows under his eyes that matched my own, but he'd gotten a haircut, the same style he'd worn when we first met. He'd also lost weight, though I hated myself for even noticing that after everything that had happened. "Hi," I said softly as he sat down. "Hi." He wouldn't quite meet my eyes. "I got your letter." "Oh." I wrapped my hands around my water glass, needing something to hold on to. "I meant every word." "I know you did." He sighed, finally looking at me directly. "That's part of the problem, Sarah. You always mean what you say in the moment, but the moment changes and so do your feelings." "That's not fair," I protested, then caught myself. "No, you're right. I've been inconsistent and unfair to you. I've been taking you for granted and using you as an emotional punching bag because I'm unhappy with myself." Mark's expression softened slightly. "At least you're being honest now." "I am. And I want to keep being honest." I took a deep breath. "I miss you, not just because the house is empty or because I'm lonely, but because you're my best friend. Because life doesn't make sense without you in it." "I miss you too," he admitted quietly. "But I can't unhear what you said. Every time I think about coming home, I wonder what else you've been saying about me. What other ways I've disappointed you." "You haven't disappointed me," I said, fighting back tears. "I'm the one who's been disappointing. I stopped appreciating everything you are because I was too focused on everything I'm not." A waiter approached, and we both ordered coffee, neither of us mentioning food. After he left, Mark spoke again. "I've been doing some thinking too, about how we got here. Maybe I haven't been as present as I should be. Maybe I've gotten too comfortable, stopped trying as hard." "No, Mark, that's not." He held up a hand. "Let me finish. I'm not taking blame for what you said, but I am acknowledging that relationships take work from both people. And maybe we both stopped working as hard as we should have." The waiter returned with our coffees, and I watched as Mark added exactly 1 sugar and a splash of cream, the same way he'd taken it on our first date. Some things never changed, even when everything else did. "Do you remember what you said to me on our wedding day?" Mark asked suddenly, stirring his coffee. "During your vows?" I nodded, my throat tight. "I promised to choose you every day, not just that day. To love the person you are and the person you'd become. And I promised to be your anchor when you needed stability, and your wings when you needed to fly." He gave a bitter laugh. "Somewhere along the way, you started seeing the anchor as a weight dragging you down." His words hit me like a punch to the gut because they were true. I'd stopped seeing Mark's stability as a gift and started viewing it as stagnation. I'd blamed him for keeping me grounded when I was the one who'd stopped trying to fly. "I've been in therapy," I said quietly. "Twice a week. I'm finally dealing with my own issues instead of projecting them onto you. And I know it might be too late, but I want you to know I'm working on myself, not just for us, but for me." Mark was quiet for a long moment, studying his coffee cup. "I'm proud of you for doing that," he finally said. "But you're right, it might be too late." Those words felt like ice in my veins. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I need more time. I'm saying I don't know if I can trust that this change is permanent, or if in 6 months you'll be telling someone else how disappointing I am." "I wouldn't." "You already did." His voice was gentle but firm. "And the worst part is, I didn't even see it coming. I thought we were okay. Not perfect, but okay. Finding out how you really felt, it made me question everything." I reached across the table, not quite touching his hand but leaving mine there, an invitation. "That wasn't how I really felt. That was me being petty and small and taking out my frustrations on the one person who's always been there for me." "Maybe," he said. "But words like that don't come from nowhere, Sarah. They were inside you somewhere." He was right, of course. The words had come from a dark place inside me, a place of dissatisfaction and blame that I'd allowed to grow unchecked. But they weren't the whole truth. Not even close. "Can I tell you what else is inside me?" I asked. When he nodded, I continued. "Pride, every time someone compliments the garden you've created in our backyard. Joy when I hear you singing badly in the shower. Gratitude when you bring me tea without asking, because you can tell I'm having a rough day. Love when you do that little victory dance after beating a hard level in your video games." A ghost of a smile touched his lips at that last one. And I pressed on. "Those thoughtless words I said? They came from the worst part of me. But they're not the truth. The truth is, if I met you today, I'd fall in love with you all over again. Because you're still the kind, patient, wonderful man I married. You're still the person who makes me laugh when I'm taking myself too seriously, who believes in me even when I don't believe in myself. Mark finally met my eyes fully, and I could see the conflict there. The love warring with hurt, the desire to believe fighting against the fear of being hurt again. I want to believe that, he said softly. But I think we both need more time. I need to know that these changes you're making are real and lasting, and you need to figure out what you really want. From life, from our marriage, from yourself. What does that mean for us? I asked, dreading the answer, but knowing I needed to hear it. Mark ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar it made my heart ache. I think we need a trial separation, a real one, with boundaries and goals, not just me crashing at Dave's while we figure things out. The words hit me like a physical blow, but I forced myself to stay calm. What kind of boundaries? 3 months, he said, as if he'd already thought this through. We live separately, see our own therapists, work on ourselves. We can check in once a week, maybe meet for coffee like this. But no trying to rush back to normal. No pretending the problems don't exist. I wanted to protest, to beg him to come home, to promise I'd never say another thoughtless word. But I knew he was right. We needed this time, both of us. Okay? I said, my voice barely above a whisper. 3 months. And Sarah? His voice softened slightly. I think you should write during this time. Really write, not just talk about writing. It's part of who you are, and somewhere along the way, you stopped believing in that part of yourself. Maybe that's why you stopped believing in us, too. Tears spilled down my cheeks before I could stop them. Trust Mark to see right to the heart of things, to understand me better than I understood myself. I'd stopped writing because I was afraid of failure, and somehow that fear had poisoned everything else in my life, including my marriage. I will, I promised. I already started journaling again. He nodded, then stood up. I should go. I'll have my lawyer draw up a formal separation agreement. Nothing permanent, just something that outlines our arrangement for the next 3 months. The word lawyer made everything feel suddenly, terrifyingly real. Mark, I called as he turned to leave. He paused, looking back at me. I love you. I know I haven't shown it well lately, but I do. For a moment, his composed expression cracked, showing the pain underneath. I love you too, Sarah. That's what makes this so hard. After he left, I sat in that booth for a long time, remembering our first date in the same restaurant. How young and full of hope we'd been, how certain that love would be enough to overcome any obstacle. We'd been right about the love part. It was still there, running deep and true beneath all the hurt and misunderstandings. But love alone wasn't enough. It needed work, commitment, and honesty to survive. The next 3 months would be the hardest of my life, but as I finally left Riley's that night, I made a promise to myself. I would use this time not just to save my marriage, but to save myself. To become the kind of person who builds up rather than tears down, who faces her fears instead of projecting them onto others, who loves wholly and without reservation. Because Mark deserved that kind of wife. And more importantly, I deserved to be that kind of person. The separation was both harder and more enlightening than I expected. True to his word, Mark kept our weekly coffee meetings, though the first few were painfully awkward. We talked about surface things at first, work, the weather, mutual friends. But gradually, as weeks passed, we began to have real conversations again. I threw myself into therapy and writing. Dr. Thompson helped me understand how my fear of failure had manifested as criticism of others, particularly Mark. I started writing every day, not just in my journal, but working on the novel I'd abandoned. The words came slowly at first, then faster as I remembered why I'd loved writing in the first place. 1 month into our separation, I had a breakthrough in therapy that left me sobbing in Dr. Thompson's office. I've been punishing Mark for being content, I admitted through tears. Because I wasn't content, and instead of dealing with that, I resented him for finding peace in his life. Mark was making changes too. During one of our coffee meetings, he told me he'd started therapy as well. I realized I stopped sharing things with you, he said. Not just the big things, but the small dreams too. I got comfortable in our routine and stopped trying to grow together. By the second month, we'd progressed to having dinner together once a week. During one of these dinners, Mark asked to read some of my writing. I hesitated but agreed, sharing a short story I'd recently finished. His feedback was thoughtful and encouraging, just as it had always been. "You found your voice again," he said, looking up from the pages. "It's stronger than before." The third month was the hardest, because hope had begun to bloom, but nothing was certain. We were both changing, growing, but would it be enough? Would we grow together or apart? The night before our 3 months were up, I sat in my home office, looking at old photos. There was one from our second date, both of us laughing at some forgotten joke. Another from the day we moved into our house, covered in paint but beaming. Our wedding day, dancing under strings of lights. Simple moments that added up to a life together. I wrote Mark one final letter. "Dear Mark, tomorrow marks 3 months since we decided to separate. In that time, I've written 47,000 words of my novel, attended 24 therapy sessions, and thought about you approximately 1 million times a day. I've learned that I can stand on my own, but I don't want to. Not because I need you, but because I choose you. Every day, just like I promised in my vows. I've learned that love isn't about finding someone perfect, but about growing together through the imperfect moments. It's about choosing to build up rather than tear down, to face problems together rather than assign blame. The woman who said those horrible things 3 months ago? She was lost and afraid, and she lashed out at the person who least deserved it. I'm not that woman anymore. I'm someone who understands that real love is in the quiet moments. The coffee you make, just the way I like it, the way you still laugh at your own bad jokes, the strength you show in fighting for our marriage, even when it would have been easier to walk away. If I met you today, I wouldn't just date you. I would thank my lucky stars for finding someone so patient, kind, and real. Someone who pushes me to be better while accepting me as I am. Someone who knows all my flaws and loves me anyway. Whatever you decide tomorrow, know that these 3 months have changed me forever. I'm finally becoming the person I want to be, and you're a big part of why that's possible. All my love, Sarah." The next morning, we met at Riley's one last time. I handed him the letter before either of us could speak. As he read, I watched his face, trying to read every micro-expression. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. "Move back in with me," he said quietly. My heart stopped. "Are you sure?" He reached across the table and took my hand. "I'm sure that I want to keep growing with you. I'm sure that we're both different people than we were 3 months ago. And I'm sure that I love you. Not just who you were or who you might become, but who you are right now." I squeezed his hand, tears rolling down my cheeks. "I love you too. All of you. Exactly as you are." We still had work to do. Bridges to rebuild, trust to restore. But as we walked out of Riley's together, I knew we would make it. Because this time, we were choosing each other, with our eyes wide open, knowing both the challenges and the rewards that lay ahead. Sometimes it takes almost losing everything to realize what you had all along. But if you're lucky, really, really lucky, you get a second chance to do things right.